Hi everybody, welcome. We're just letting everybody in. As you will have just received a notification as you joined the call, we're recording this webinar. That's so that people can catch up afterwards who haven't made it today. If you are happy with that, then feel free to keep your camera on, keep your put your hand up, add comments, and so on. If you would like to remain more in the background, then just yeah, keep your cameras off and bear that in mind. But yeah, should be a really productive hour that we've got ahead of us now. So yeah, I'm delighted to be joined by three fantastic women, all of whom have published books on the topic of belonging, and we'll be spending time today, yeah, talking about how to measure belonging within your organizations. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I did it by accident a moment ago, so let's see if I can have better success this time. I think I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to ask Hannah if you can, running really slowly, if you can confirm that now you see
It's,
slowly.
I think it's your computer must be overheating. Yeah, it's all good. I can see it now. It's all working.
Yes, my computer is overheating. It's yeah, it's creating its own. I've got my own little radiator sitting in front of me at the moment. But yeah, so yeah, this is, as Hannah mentioned in the chat, this is our second of two sessions, third of three if you count last week's conversation where we spoke about retention as part of the Edurio People Power Day. But we are focusing on belonging in schools. And the first session we held a few weeks ago. And for those of you who were there, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it valuable. Thank you for coming back again. That's a ringing endorsement for the value that you found in the first session. And those of you who are new today, you'll receive the recording of both once we've wrapped this up. So yeah, today is all about measuring belonging. Um, we spoke last time around thinking about the overall environment and how belonging looks within schools for staff and pupils. But today we're focusing on how to measure belonging. And I am joined today by Hannah, who is the founder of Belonging Effect. And I'm also joined by Natasha and Fumi, who work at a trust together, but have done a lot of work in the sector more broadly around equity, diversity, and inclusion within schools. So we're going to have a really exciting conversation, and then there'll be room for questions and discussion at the end. Please do add questions in the chat directly as we go. Either as they come up, we might be able to address them directly then if they're a quick thing that sort of relates specifically to that moment in the conversation. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for discussion. We might also invite people in the room to share their experiences and challenges if they are happy to do so. So with all that in mind, we can jump straight in, and I'm going to start by handing over to Hannah. Hannah's done loads and loads of work with trusts across England in belonging more broadly, but also how to measure it. Where you need to know where you are now in order to know where you need to go next. So Hannah, over to you.
Thank you, Iona. You can click onto the next slide for me. That picture was just really emphasizing the fact that my overarching kind of like take on data and belonging data in schools is that we are data rich when it comes to the pupils and data poor when it comes to the staff. And one of the things I want you to think about is what data we're actually drawing on and how we close those gaps. And I come to this conversation as someone who spent 20 years working in secondary schools. The last year of my career was in a primary school as well. Started in Kent, moved to London, was working in Oxfordshire. But I've always been involved in the grassroots scene and care very passionately about what I used to call EDI, which I now call DEIB, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion and Belonging. And these are the two books I've been involved in. So 4 years ago, I co-edited a book called Diverse Educators Manifesto. There's 125 voices in there, and it's structured around the Equality Act. And you don't need to read it in a linear fashion. You can dip in and out of the different chapters. And then at the start of this year, I published a book around cultivating belonging in schools. And it was actually quite hard to keep everything to the word count because it was one of the small practical guides in the Little Guide series. So I speak about this kind of like strategy, this concept in both of those two texts. So Iona, if you could click me on, please. I'm going to start by like outlining, I guess, like why we're here. And we all know that belonging has become a massive buzzword in education. I don't think I see a day on social media or an event without the word belonging being censored. But I want us to really think about what is it we're trying to measure, because I think people are getting very busy with the measuring, but being clear on why do we need to measure it, how are we currently measuring it, and what are we trying to measure, and what do we want to actually find out. I don't think we're pausing enough to actually ask those questions and to be super clear. The three C's at the top there, we run about 40 different training sessions at the moment on DEIB across the whole of the Equality Act. And we always frame them through what I call the three C's. So consciousness, confidence, and competence. So hopefully your measurement of belonging through all your different stakeholders and identity groups will bring consciousness to the trustees, the governors, the executive team, the leaders within your schools and trust. But it will also bring confidence, because I do fear that in the last few years there's been a lot of activity around DEIB, but are we always confident we're doing the right thing to reduce harm? We might actually be perpetuating the harm if we're not informed. So I think the data has to guide what we're doing. And the competence piece is we have a bias for action in education about getting busy and solving the problems. We have to be conscious of who we are and confident in what we're doing before we can become competent in it. And we are so data savvy when it comes to pupils and it comes to attainment and achievement and attendance and behaviour. And I know we've got a lot of HR professionals on the call. I do think there's the people data piece that we need to get a bit more competent with how we handle that and how we articulate that as well. So Iona, next slide, please. I'll give you some things to think about, and then Iona's going to bring it to life with the national kind of survey, and then for me and Natasha are going to talk more about the work they've been doing in their part of the system. So we updated our branding last year, and our mantra is shaping attention into impact. And I want you to really think about like what is your intention in being here tonight? What is it you want to take away? And what impact do you want this dialogue, this conversation to have on your practice and on your trust's sort of like practice and culture, but thinking then at large, what is our intention for measuring it? Because I do think sometimes we've got too much data. And if I see one more report about the lack of racial diversity of teachers in the education UK system, like, we don't need any more data. We know we've got an issue. It's what we're going to do with that data and how that data actually shapes our strategy. So I think we need to be really intentional about what data we're asking for, how we're going to use it, and what impact we need it to have in our work as well. Thank you, Iona. And I wanted just to start here because I do think sometimes we get a little bit narrow on the data has to be quantitative. And there's a lot of qualitative data that actually we can be collating that really informs belonging. I think people are struggling with the idea of measuring belonging because it doesn't feel tangible. It's about culture. It's about our sense of place, our sense of connectivity. And I think if we compare belonging in the culture of a workplace to diversifying the curriculum, we can see that we're diversifying the curriculum. We can quantify it. We can have metrics around it, so it's easier to gauge it and easier to measure it. Whereas I do think the belonging piece feels a bit trickier because it's more nebulous. So thinking about how we balance those two together, and what data sets we're drawing on, and how we need the data set to inform us about the demographic distribution, for example, representation across our candidates, but then thinking about the qualitative piece that comes with it. And we need to have a range of both types of methodology rather than perhaps defaulting to one or the other, that they both have their place, but in different ways. So thank you, Iona. And I want to start here, like, how is the data helping us understand the diversity profile demographic of our stakeholders? Because when I was teaching, when I was a middle leader, a senior leader, a head, I could have told you the demographic breakdown of all of our pupils. We knew it off by heart. Every class I taught, I could have told you who was in that room. But the more senior I got as a leader, I didn't have that data about staff. So we had massive data gaps, and becoming more senior, I got more access to HR data, but the HR data was often quite gappy. And now when I run training for SLTs, for trust leadership teams, we talk about this at length about over the last decade, and I've been in education for 25 years now, like the questions we asked when people applied for jobs, when we onboarded them, and what information people were willing to give us, we have got historic gaps. And now we're asking for people to share quite personal data, but are we reassuring them about how that data is going to be used? I often get called in as the kind of the cavalry to sort out the fact that there's been an email gone out to all staff in a trust, can you fill in the diversity survey? And they haven't been told why they're filling it in. and there hasn't been clarity around the strategic intent about why the data is being collected. Hannah, can you come and do a keynote and talk them all into filling in the form? I think we're doing this a bit backwards, okay? Being clear on what is it we're trying to achieve, articulating that, I find doing some foundational training and then asking people to do the survey, you get a better uptake. So if we think through the lens of these 9 protected characteristics, what data do we currently hold and what data do we need? And where does that data sit? Because the schools I've worked in, that data might not have all been on one portal. It might have been in safeguarding for some of the pupils, attendance and behaviour for some of the pastoral, attainment in the curriculum trackers. So thinking about how we actually harvest it and harmonise it is quite important, but how we then track it and break it down and report on it is also important. I think we're getting better at doing this through the kind of the diversity lens for behaviour attendance, but are we doing it for who's applying for jobs, who's getting the job, who's getting promoted? I think we could have a better handling of the staff data per se. On the next slide, please, Iona. I want to just use the metaphor of a iceberg. Don't worry too much about all the words on here. But the reason I just picked this diagram is that what I see, and we work with thousands of schools, colleges and trusts, nationally and internationally, is that the diversity they are talking about is often the diversity they think they can see. And we need to be really, really careful about this because even with race or faith, we cannot always see someone's diversity markers. And I think I'm seeing a lot of reactivity where, oh, we're going to do some work on race, we're going to do some work on disability because we think we can see those 2 traits, but then we're not paying attention to the diversities that perhaps are less visible. And then we create a false hierarchy of attention and focus within the setting. It worries me that some settings are then taking an approach of we're going to do a deep dive into one protected characteristic each year. Because in a school, you spend 7 years in a primary school, 7 years in a secondary school, and there are 9 identities protected in law. So some people's identity will never show up. And we have got to think about people more holistically, that people's identities are much more complex than them ticking one box in a survey. For a lot of people, they coexist in multiple identities. So some of my team have 4, 5, 6 protected characteristics. So we've also got to think more holistically about that data and how that data speaks to one another as well. Thank you, Iona. So we think about the data that we are collating when it comes to diversity, and we need to think broadly here by what we mean by diversity. A lot of people talk about diverse or non-diverse as being specifically around race. We're thinking here through all 9 protected characteristics. I'd ask you to really think about what data are you currently holding and looking at when it comes to the pupils' diversity, the staff's diversity, the parent and carers diversity. And I got some great feedback on the blog I published this morning. And what about the governors? We do loads of work with governors and trustees, and we often don't hold their diversity data either. So really thinking about actually what profile do we have in each of those stakeholder groups? And most settings will be able to say to me, we've got a disconnect or a dissonance between the diversity levels of our pupils versus our staff. So that's great knowledge. But do you then know the profile of your local community and the profile of your governing body as well? And are your governors representing the diversity? And Iona will talk about then how you can then benchmark that nationally, because I think we sometimes get into a bit of a local regional mindset, but we need to think about the national data sets as well. Thank you, Iona. And the term or the concept of intersectionality is really, really important at this moment. So thinking about how we are looking at the data through an intersectional lens. Again, if I can give you a metaphor to help you think about this, think about those 9 colours of the 9 protected characteristics. We think about looking through a kaleidoscope. Okay, you're looking through a kaleidoscope and looking at the overlay of all of those different identities and how people can coexist and have multiple layers of advantage or multiple layers of disadvantage. I spent hours as a head of English filtering on my spreadsheets, looking at who was in my year group, who was in which class, who was making progress. Was there a pattern, a trend there about boys, girls, about white boys, SEND boys, PP boys? That's the level of data we need to be looking at. So we might not use the term intersectional data handling when it comes to what we do, but I think we do it quite well with the pupils. We need to do it better with the staff, where we're really drilling down and looking at not only the main categories, but the subcategories as well. And on the next slide, I think that brings it to life a little bit more. Yeah, okay. So if we think about the experience of women, for example, in the sector, we know we are female heavy. We know we have got glass ceilings when it comes to the progress of women into senior leadership roles, particularly headship and CEO. We know we've got a pay gap difference, but are we then looking at the intersectionality of women who are women of colour, women who are also parents and carers? That's where we have to really be looking at the data and looking at my experience of being a female leader in education was different to some of my peers based on my identity characteristics. And we often just lump everyone into one category, and we've got to refine it and really distinguish it and differentiate it to look at the unique experience that person is having. Thank you, Iona. So if we think about what we're trying to ascertain, I'm going to reverse engineer this slide. So when I'm doing sessions around belonging, I often ask the question in the room, what does belonging mean to you? And then I put up this slide. These are like the 10 responses I hear the most frequently when people talk about belonging. And it's not hierarchical. These are the different ways people might describe or articulate what belonging means to them. So if we're trying to measure it, these are the kind of words we need to be asking when we are doing surveys, when we are doing focus groups, asking about people's relationship to their visibility, to their voice and how their voice matters, how they feel about their workplace experience, levels of things like respect, feeling valued, feeling trusted. So this is about us understanding how people feel and how often we are checking in on them to ask them how they feel. And I fear that we often wait for the exit interview. They've decided to leave, and then we ask them what their experience is. Actually, best practice is that we have an ongoing opportunity for people to be able to talk about and share, whether that's with their line manager or a senior leader. And one of the things, I might have said this last time, one of the things I want to disrupt or challenge for you, and please challenge whether people use this, a lot of leaders are very proud around their open door policy, and anyone can come and talk to me anytime and share anything with me. But please look at who's coming through your threshold and coming to your open door to give you feedback, because some people won't. They won't come and say to you, I've got a problem with my line manager, I'm feeling excluded, I don't feel respected. So we have to have multiple methods of how people can express how they're feeling. And sometimes it needs to be anonymous because they might not feel safe enough to be able to put their name to it as well. Thank you, Iona. So if we then think about the kind of the how we move from the quantitative to the qualitative and all the different voice activities that we have embedded with educational culture, looking at our calendar for next year, which has probably just been published in our settings, where are the opportunities for pupil voice, staff voice, parent voice, but also governance voice? They often get forgotten. And what sort of questions are we asking? And rather than having survey fatigue and creating an extra survey, is there an opportunity to insert some questions into the existing mechanisms and to be more intentional? I've seen people create their own survey where literally they've asked people so many questions, it takes them an hour and a half to fill it in. It then takes the poor DIB leader about 5 weeks to read all the data. So think about what are we actually trying to find out? What questions are we asking? And how do we actually make the survey work for us so the data is actually useful? I think we're actually collecting too much data sometimes, and actually to have less data, but then follow up with some listening circles. So one of the MATs I support, who I own in a team have worked with, they've got 8 primary schools, and their data was really positive. It really validated who they were and their culture and their trust. But there were 2 things flagged, and they weren't quite sure what to do with that data. It told them that some of their staff who were disabled felt less included, and some of their staff who were LGBT felt less safe. And they were overcomplicating what to do next. So we basically just decided that all they needed to do was to offer 2 focus groups and create a space for people to come forward and to sit in a safe space and to talk it out, because they were jumping to assumptions about problems in their trust. And actually, it was quite a small group of people. They just needed to have a closer detail and a listening ear to find out about their unique experience. Thank you, Iona. Then we've got 2 slides left. So when I supported Edurio with their initial EDI report and I wrote the conclusion, the bit that still stays with me from that data selection and collation was around this idea of the perception gap, and how in every setting we have got a perception gap where the senior leader's relationship with belonging, psychological safety, visibility, voice and value is different to the experience that staff have elsewhere in the institution. And I think sometimes we as leaders are in our comfort zone. We feel safe, we feel seen, we feel valued, thereby we feel that the rest of our staff will have the same experience. And the really difficult bit of this work is being vulnerable enough to ask and to hear that people's reality and lived experience is different to our own. And then what are we going to do with that knowledge, and how are we going to disrupt our own comfort zone and our own confidence levels to go and find out actually what's the reality for the cleaner, for the receptionist, for the beginner teacher who's in our setting. Thank you, Iona. And as a former English teacher, I always want to not look at the numbers, but look at the stories that the numbers are telling me. I think sometimes we get a little bit regurgitating all the numbers, but actually, what is the data telling me? What do we know? What do we need to know? What we're going to change as a result? So if we're looking at our data and we've got a high attrition of a particular demographic, we're losing our global majority teachers. That to me is a big red flag. How are we going to go and ask some questions, find out what's going on, what's going wrong, to make sure that we can listen to this and learn from this and make some changes? I think sometimes we ignore the data because people are moving on, or it's too uncomfortable to perhaps ask them those bigger questions. So for me, the stories are often there, but we need to excavate them and we need to sort of dig into them. Thank you, Iona. I'm going to hand over to you now then to bring it to life with the survey that you and the team work on.
Yes, thank you very much, Hannah, for painting the kind of picture of how we go about doing this from a structural level. And I think the data I'm about to show, I've only got a few graphs that I've kind of cherry picked that sort of take a few different parts of what it might mean to belong and highlight some of the challenges that we see there. But I think I'm going to start actually with what Hannah said on a couple of slides ago around that perception gap. So one thing that we kind of saw consistently when we did that survey 5 years ago now, I think it was, the initial survey on the experience of staff looking at different protected characteristics and how they experience equality, diversity, and inclusion within their organisation. And we found a consistent trend that the majority group felt that the organisation was better at EDI than their peers in with other backgrounds. The kind of headline data from that was things like these numbers might be wrong, but 75% of staff felt that all staff are treated equally. If we looked at that by gender, men were far more likely to feel that they were treated equally, well, slightly more likely to feel that they were treated equally than women, and much more likely than those with a different gender identity. We found that those with a disability were those without a disability were more likely to feel that that everyone was treated equally than those with a disability. We saw kind of time and time again throughout the data that these kind of differences in perceptions were prevalent. And I've got just 4 graphs and then a few sort of high level stories to tell around that to kind of emphasize the point. This is really the tip of the iceberg on the data that exists, but hopefully it gives a bit of a gist of where we are now. I think as well, to Hannah's point, you said something a moment ago, if you see another report that tells us about the problem, this all comes from reports that is telling us about the problem. So I'm not going to spend forever on it because we've made it to this webinar, so we are in agreement that there is work to be done on improving DEIB within the sector. So yeah, just starting off, if we look at the question of diversity within schools, there is a reasonable sense that the staff body is quite diverse. 14% have reported that it's not very diverse or not diverse at all. Actually, if we look at the census, we can see that majority is a term for a reason. There are majority groups and minority groups and marginalized groups. So, but this as an overall figure is not too bad. It's interesting when we look at diversity. Your own characteristics don't seem to have much of an impact on this. So, regardless of what makes me, I will look around me and I will see diversity to a similar degree to somebody else who what makes them is different. However, this is about the staff body, so this is about all of the staff within the organisation. If we look at the colour of these bars and the length of these bars, when we ask about the leadership team, we've got a lot less green and a lot more red. So there's a kind of cycle that's at play here. So Hannah mentioned that the more senior she got, the more she realized that she didn't have access to data that she needed. Hannah realized that and looked at how to work on that. It is likely the case across organizations that where the data is not so strong, we can't see it on the quantifiable level, so we can't know what we're working with. And also, the more senior we get, the less we are working on the day-to-day stuff, and less we are experiencing things that others are experiencing. So here we have a situation where the leadership team is much less diverse than the wider staff body. And as I said when I started this, those who are in a majority group are more likely to feel that things are okay from the perspective of DEIB. And then on top of that, you have the complicating factor that those who are in a leadership position are more likely to be in the majority group. So I'm in a leadership position, I'm spending less time experiencing the day-to-day life of the rest of my team, and I happen to be more likely, and it's not universally true, that there is no diversity in leadership, and diversity shows up in lots of different ways. But if I'm in a leadership position, my peers are less diverse than the wider staff body, and we are a group that is more likely to feel that things are okay, and we're the ones that are in the position that we can change it. So there is a real challenge here around kind of at least acknowledging that we don't have the same experience as others around us. If we look at some of the additional data, so where I said on the data around diversity, we don't see much difference based on individual characteristics on what they're observing. Diversity is something that they're looking around and they're seeing, and they're speaking to people and they're understanding. As Hannah mentioned, a lot of times this is about visible diversity rather than all the other things that make people who they are. But when it comes to how people feel themselves and how inclusive they feel their organisation is, there is a real difference. So if we look at this on the whole, this looks pretty good. 4% of the people who've taken our survey don't feel that their organisation is inclusive. 96% feel that it's at least somewhat inclusive, and nearly 4 in 5 feel that it is quite or very inclusive. But that's at the national level. That's including all of the majority, all the people that hold a majority characteristic. When we break that down by characteristics, that's somewhat different. Interestingly, when we look at age, we don't see a big difference between how inclusive staff feel. I'm going to talk in a moment about these breakdowns and share a bit more nuance. But when it came to age, there wasn't a big difference. But when it came to gender, ethnicity, and whether or not the person is disabled, we saw that those who are in the majority group were more positive about, more confident that their organisation is inclusive than those in a minority who hold a minority characteristic. There's a couple more things that I'll show that sort of that highlight this. We also look at some of the structures in place. So we ask the question, how easy or difficult is it to report discrimination? And again, not a huge proportion that feel that it is difficult to report discrimination. Much more people feel that it is easy to report discrimination than it is difficult. But the moment we look at that by different characteristics, we're seeing a similar trend. So again, not a massive difference by age. I'll talk in a minute about where there are some of those things. But by gender, by ethnicity, and by disability status, we are seeing that there are differences between the majority group and the minority group. And if we have a look at this, as I've kind of shared on the previous slides, I think that if we look at the average, we can sort of let ourselves off easily. The average, if we think about numbers and we think about sort of statistics in general, the average is going to show a higher proportion of majority voices than it is going to show marginalized voices, because there are more people with a majority background than there are with a minority background. Obviously, this is different when we're talking about things which aren't. So if we look at gender, there is a more even split between proportion of men and women in the overall population at schools. Actually, the more marginalized group of women is usually outnumbering the more advantaged group of men. But then you have the sort of compounding issue of those with another gender identity who are much less represented in large scale data like this, because it is comparatively such a small group, but are having the worst experience of those of all. So just running through this, this comes from our wider staff experience survey. So Hannah mentioned a moment ago, you might be better off weaving this into your wider listening exercises and your wider staff data, rather than doing a separate in-depth survey about these topics. What we've done at Edurio is we have our detailed EDI survey, but then we also capture data on protected characteristics if people want to share it in our wider staff experience survey. So here we're looking across the whole staff experience, what it's like to be a staff member in an English school. And we see that on the whole, it's not the case in every single question for every single part of the experience, but on the whole, male staff are slightly more positive than women. In some cases, a bit more, some cases a bit less. When we look at those with another gender identity, the experience is the least positive for most of the questions that we ask, and the gap is big. Again, if we look at the kind of overall experience, when we look at it through age, it's quite interesting. Staff under the age of 25 and staff over the age of 55 tend to have a slightly worse experience than those between 25 and 54. So that middle bit, when you're in your kind of you're not totally new to the world of work, but you're also not yet kind of in the final stages, much more likely to have a more positive experiences. The gap isn't huge between that middle section and the beginning and the end, but there is a gap. We do see that younger and older staff have slightly worse experiences. When we look at ethnicity, it's really interesting. We depending on the topic, so, there isn't a sort of very clear-cut case that white British staff are having a more positive experience than minority staff. This is a theme that we've seen kind of across the staff body, across the staff data sets over time. Depending on what we're looking at, the experience might be more positive for white British staff, or it could be least positive. One thing that I think is quite interesting that stands out there is how much they enjoy work. So white British staff are less likely to say that they enjoy their work than staff with a different ethnicity, whereas some of those more structural things, we see that story is somewhat reversed. But as I say, we haven't found a kind of really clear story here, which I think is interesting itself. Clear challenge around disability. We see very clear differences throughout both the EDI survey and the staff experience survey. Those with a disability, disabled staff, whether that's invisible disability or visible disability, disabled staff tend to have a worse experience. They feel that things are less fair. They're more likely to feel they've been sort of deterred from going for a promotion. There is a very clear challenge here across the sector. And then finally, there's something around parental status that needs some attention. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Maternity Teacher, Paternity Teacher, which is an organisation run by Emma Shepherd. She's focused on the fact that the largest cohort to leave the sector is women in their 30s, and at the point that you become a mother, that is a really key moment in the journey, and one where we might be losing staff at that point. It is worth noting that this group is also the largest group that we have. There are more women, and so more women leaving from that group is not necessarily a surprise, but we can see that there is a clear trigger at the point that people can't become parents, that then there is a challenge around retention. As I say, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and I've just tried to sort of give some illustrative points here. But the overall thing I want people to take away is that perception gap between leaders and non-leaders, and the notion that those who hold a majority characteristic are more likely to feel like things are okay than those who don't. And that's more important than just saying I feel respected, or things like that. It's I, as a majority, as a person with a majority characteristic, I think that our organisation is doing well. So there are blind spots there that need to be addressed and need to be considered. So yeah, that's a kind of quick run through the data. but this is more about this session is more about the principles and how we do this. So I'll hand over now to Natasha and Fumi.
Hi everyone, I'm Natasha and I'm here with Funmi. We work for a trust and we're based in West Yorkshire, and we are also the co-authors of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in Schools. And we're going to share some of our thoughts around implementing and measuring belonging in schools, and discuss some of the work that we've done as well. So in our book, one of the chapters focuses on developing a whole school strategy for ED&I. And at the root of that, I suppose the first step to do in order to do that is to measure belonging. Hannah's already touched on this, but belonging is overused in the sector, and there's not always a shared understanding of what it actually means. So for us, one of the things which, Iona, could you go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Thanks. So for us, what was really important to do was just think about what belonging actually means in our context. And in the book, we draw on two different definitions of belonging. And I'll just give everyone just a few seconds just to read through that. And I think it's important to have a definition of belonging within your school context. So there's a shared language for staff and for students with talking about it. And even some of the words within the lists that are on the screen there, feeling accepted, respected, included, is thinking about what that actually looks like as well, because that's not always clear, and giving examples, non-examples. So for people to know that if you interrupt someone when they are talking, then that affects people's feeling of appreciation, of feeling accepted, of feeling respected. So examples, non-examples are included, but making sure there's a shared understanding of what belonging is really, really essential as well. And then Hannah's mentioned this already, but it's thinking about, if this is what belonging is, what does it actually look like within our school, within our trust? And that is what is really, really tricky, and it's really, really complex as well, because there's so much that you could talk about with regards to belonging. And in terms of the different protected characteristics, if you focus on one, you're at risk of alienating other people. And then you don't want it to be tokenistic and have a month or half a year focusing on one protected characteristic. So it is just thinking about where you're going to go with that and what the priorities need to be. And data is a massive part of that, and thinking about where you're going to get the data from. But for us, thinking about belonging for student experience, it's thinking of that as an upstream driver of well-being, of attendance and achievement for students. But for staff, it's linked to recruitment, it's linked to retention, but also career progression as well. So it is kind of going back to your context and thinking about belonging, but also what are the outcomes of belonging for you. And within the book, we have two case studies from two different academies, where one of the academies looks at extracurricular as a way to increase belonging, with a focus on attendance. And then there's also another trust that looks at curriculum representation as well. Once you've got the definition for belonging, the next step is reviewing existing evidence. And, oh, sorry, Iona, could you just go back one? Thank you. Is reviewing the existing evidence and thinking. Hannah talked about being data rich and data poor in certain areas, and it's thinking about where you have got the evidence. And Hannah's completely right. Often with students, we have that data, we don't have it for staff. So one of the areas that I lead in is I head up teacher training, and we didn't have the ED&I data that we needed in order for our trainees to thrive. So things like, where are they based? Do they need to have a job alongside training to teach? So we have got mechanisms in place now, so we can get that data and put things in place in the program to support them, to help them to meet the demands of the training year as well. I'll just give a very brief anecdote before I hand over to Funmi. But one of the things that we've put in place in our trust is a program for senior leaders from the global majority, and actually selecting people for that was really, really challenging because of the data gaps that we had. So going to HR and getting the data, but if people haven't disclosed what their race is, you don't have the data. So that means people who should be taking part don't get to take part because you haven't invited them. And then another risk is then you start making assumptions about people, and you assume somebody isn't from the global majority based on their skin color, if they're white passing, because we've certainly had that experience as well with staff, or you make assumptions based on names as well. So for us, it was thinking really carefully about, right, if I need that data, I need to realize there are gaps. What other mechanisms need to be put in place to make sure no one slips through the net, so to speak? And that's thinking about, right, so we've got a message, personal invitations, but we also need wider comms around it as well. For me, I'll hand over to you for the next one.
Thank you. We're still on the same slide. I knew that was going to happen. I was thinking we should have moved them onto different slides. I think what I'm about to say links really closely to what Hannah was saying earlier about not rigidly sticking to that quantitative data, because when we first started out as a trust, it was the first time we'd kind of looked into ED&I, and so we didn't have loads of survey data available that would support us in making change. And so we had various organisations established over time, like we started with an anti-racism cross-cutting team, but within that group, as Hannah also mentioned, there were people with multiple different protected characteristics, and you soon learn that kind of focusing on just one characteristic alone isn't necessarily as helpful. And so we've got kind of a range of different groups, like a Women in Education network, and like Natasha mentioned, the work with early career teachers as well. And the anecdotal evidence that we collected from those groups was incredibly valuable because, yes, we know that anecdotal evidence is qualitative by nature, but you can make that more measurable and systematic by identifying patterns and identifying frequencies within that data. So, for example, you might kind of analyze the things that people have said, and you might identify categories and themes, or even just things like prevalence can be reported. So, instead of just focusing on individual stories and thinking this remains with this group of people, you can start to indicate how widespread certain themes are. So, for example, across 6 focus groups, staff in 5 groups raise concerns about the pronunciation of their name. And so you can identify that's a theme, and it's something that requires some professional development and training from staff across the organisation because it's something that's so prevalent. And that really does come from kind of creating those safe spaces for people to speak about their experiences and to give that anecdotal evidence. It can also be triangulated with survey data, so you can use them together to explain or illustrate the quantitative findings. So, for example, if survey data showed that 70% of students felt they belonged in school, you wouldn't just want to run with that data and think, we've achieved it, box ticked off. You could then kind of develop focus group discussions, which help you to explain the experiences of the remaining 30%. And then based on that, action can be taken to make changes. And then finally, I think anecdotal evidence can be really useful in informing the design of survey questions because it helps to identify the issues and experiences that matter most to respondents before you even attempt to measure them quantitatively. So when you gather that information in focus groups, you might identify, for example, the languages that respondents use to describe their experiences. Then you can formulate questions that people feel more comfortable answering. And it's kind of an informed data collection process rather than just creating a random survey on what you perceive belonging to be. Okay, thanks, Iona. When we have surveys and focus group questions, they need to be really carefully crafted, and that requires some really kind of hard thinking. They need to be, I know most people are accustomed to this with surveys generally, but especially in terms of measuring belonging, in order for the data to be valuable, you want to make sure that you are avoiding the survey leaving employees in any specific direction or kind of restricting the responses in any way. And although closed questions might feel appealing to allow for easily filterable quantitative data, including opportunities for those lengthier comments are where you're going to get that rich data. And that's how you allow colleagues to be kind of open in their lived experiences. So the table that you can see on the screen illustrates how small tweaks to a question can have a really significant impact. And this has been quite a learning curve for us as we've been going along. So in example 1, you can see the binary nature of the question really limits the depth of the response. So it's just asking, do you see aspects of your culture, background, or identity celebrated within school? Yes or no. That might give you a percentage, but you can't drill down into which aspects are represented, which aren't. It doesn't allow for any kind of measures of intersectionality at all. And there's no kind of nuance or room for elaboration there, which really oversimplifies people's experience. And then in example two, we've got where do you see aspects of your culture, background, and identity celebrated within school? With that where, you've instantly assumed that respondents do see those aspects celebrated, and that might not be the case. And if you're someone kind of answering that survey, the impact that can have on you is really profound because you might think, right, I've got to come up with examples somewhere. My response might be judged if they find out who I am. And so we don't want to kind of subtly encourage respondents to think of examples. You have to be prepared for the fact that some people won't see themselves represented at all, and that's the data that you want to capture so that you can make a change in that area. And then in contrast, example three, how often do you see aspects of your culture, background, or identity celebrated within school? Then you've got the options very often, often, sometimes, and never. And then on top of that, you've got the provision that allows people to provide additional detail if they want to do so. And this phrasing allows for a more nuanced response. It acknowledges that representation isn't always absolute. In fact, quite rarely it is because we all have multiple facets to our identity. And it can also vary in frequency. And then that inclusion of the open-ended section invites respondents to expand on their answers. So again, it provides that really rich data and allows you to kind of see the specific aspects of their identity in which they might feel seen or overlooked. And that's where you'll see the real change start to happen when you can actually understand the people that are responding instead of just getting kind of blanket figures. Yeah, thanks, Iona.
So once the questions are carefully crafted and you've thought really careful about the sequencing of the questions as well, it is then thinking about how you're going to launch the survey. And we would really recommend making sure the rationale for the survey is clear. Avoid just sending a link. It doesn't need, as Hannah's mentioned this early on, it doesn't need to be launched either in staff meeting or with students in an assembly. So the rationale for it is really clearly understood and the framing for it as well. And then just thinking about participant safety as well. And I'm thinking of this in relation to the staff body too. So within a survey, if you are asking for data around protected characteristics, depending on the context of your school or your trust, a protected characteristic could make a participant completing the survey very visible, so they could be identifiable. And that means even without their name, they might be frightened of actually sharing their lived experience and answering the questions on their survey because they don't know what is going to happen next. So consideration does need to be given to how you're going to make sure people who may feel at risk are going to feel safe responding to a survey. So making it really clear when you're explaining the rationale, who is going to see the survey data, who is going to have access to it, and what you're going to do with the data as well. So people feel more likely to complete it. And obviously, even with hearing that, people might not feel safer, but at least you're acknowledging it and trying to reduce people just saying, actually, no, I'm not going to bother. You want to get that buy-in with it as well. And I think another way to kind of boost the rationale is thinking about the existing evidence that you have drawn on and using that to kind of inform the rationale for it as well. So if you've got data around an increase, for example, in prejudice-related incidents, that might be something actually we could put this data in, this survey in place, trying to work out more about what's going on, and then saying that you're actually going to act on the data as well, because I think that's also a risk with surveys. It's put in place, but then nothing is done with the data, and it's got to feed into everything. Thank you, Iona.
And then just to finish, we wanted to share some examples of things that have worked well for us. And one of those things was a listening campaign that we did with staff, students, and families. And I know that both Hannah and Iona mentioned the kind of perception gap earlier in terms of belonging and inclusion. And I think you referenced it specifically in relation to staff and the way that they perceive things differently. But for us, it really brought to light a gap between the perceptions of staff and students, which was quite fundamental for us in terms of trying to develop students' sense of belonging. The most significant example was that where we asked similar questions to each group so we could kind of get a sense of how people felt about different things. But one of the most significant examples was that whilst many staff reported that they felt highly confident in responding to prejudice-related incidents, lots of students actually expressed a desire for greater visibility and greater consistency in how those situations were handled. So that was really revealing to me because staff thought that they were doing a kind of a really great job in this area, but students' lived reality just wasn't that wasn't the case. And those insights were really helpful for us because it allowed us to identify that actually where are staff getting those perceptions from? What's led them to believe that they're handling things effectively? Is it because students don't feel that sense of belonging that allows them to kind of come forward and say, I don't think that was handled properly. And it allowed us to kind of implement really targeted professional learning, which helped to, I guess, as time's gone on, students have reported feeling a stronger sense of belonging once they recognise that that work has taken place. And then another kind of striking finding for us was the consistency of students' experiences across different schools. Um, so we held focus groups for students which were split by ethnicity, and that was after some survey data revealed that there were similar trends across our trust. And despite having met each other, many of our students described really remarkably similar experiences despite living in completely different geographical locations. So, for example, the experience of Black students across our trust was really similar, regardless of whether they lived in Bradford, whether they're from Leeds, Manchester, or Liverpool. And again, that allowed us to develop kind of next steps in terms of professional development for staff, but also allows us to think about what we can implement to support those students. Um, so yeah, they're just a couple of things. I don't want to be repetitive in terms of other areas, but I think have we got one more slide, Natasha?
Yes, just one more slide. So we just thought we'd end by reflecting on our learning from our involvement in terms of kind of measuring belonging. And I suppose the first thing is the idea of approaching data with curiosity. So both of us involved kind of really interested in this area, do a lot of reading around it. And I suppose what we didn't want to do is look at the data and go in with kind of confirmation bias and just kind of pursuing our own kind of areas where we think there's an issue and then looking for that data. So it's been really open when looking to the data and thinking, well, actually this is an issue. And we've talked about it several times in this session so far, but intersectionality as well, and just thinking about how what the data tells us and what the story it creates as well. And then with the data, it's thinking about, well, we've got all this data, what are we going to do with it? And then it's thinking about the mechanisms you've already got in place within the organization. So what we do with the data is it is embedded into some PD that goes on across our trust. So for example, with mentors, we have an ED&I PD, which we deliver at the start of the academic year. And we talk about some of the behaviours that they need to demonstrate in order to make sure our trainees feel that they belong as well. And then we also think about policies. We also think about facilitator training and how it can be added in. And sometimes there is a need for standalone training as well. So something Funmi and I have been involved in a few years ago now was training for school and college trust leaders and principals and using some of this data to kind of inform the messages that are needed, because again with ED&I you can't argue with the data that's there, but it is then asking the questions around the data, and as you said, Hannah, finding out the story as well, the stories of the people in our school communities.
Thank you very much, both of you. So we've got a few minutes left of the session, and I think we'd love to hear kind of, I'll stop sharing so we can all look at each other more clearly. I think it would be great to hear if we've got any questions or reflections from the group. I'm going to keep talking for a sec to give you time to either type out your questions or to put your hand up and formulate the question. But yeah, please do ask questions, and we've got some time now to discuss them. Whilst you're doing that, I'm just going to share a couple of thoughts that that have kind of stood out from the conversation today, and I think that throughout the three sections of this, we've kind of all shared that notion that that perception gap is kind of super important. I think there's also something that's important about how we're then communicating it afterwards. And so we've spoken here about, like, we're saying this is why we want to understand these this is why we want to understand these things. It's really important when we're asking for people to give their input that they know why they're giving that input and what's going to happen to it. But it's also really important after the fact to demonstrate that we're kind of doing what we said we were going to do when we set out to capture this data. So some of that is about very clearly saying beforehand, from this data, we are going to go and do these things, and then making sure we do those things and sort of highlight that and share back that we've done that. Some of it might be a little bit more open. So I think what we've spoken about here on the focus groups and the follow-up stuff and building those stories, before we start that data collection piece, we don't know everything that we're going to go and find out. And so having that sense of curiosity and saying, before we start here, we know we're going to find out something that we didn't know before. Otherwise, there was no point in us asking everybody to give their time to do the survey. And so making sure there's a plan in place for what to do with those surprises and what to do with those new things that come out. Is this a question of there's a really clear action that needs to be taken from this, whether it's PD or whether it's something else, or is it now I've got this data, I've got a whole host of new questions I need to go and find out the answer to, and then thinking, is this a follow-up survey? Is this a focus group? Is this a sort of series of one-to-one conversations and so on? And so I think, yeah, this is focused on kind of collecting that data and understanding that data, but I do think the action and then sort of closing the loop at the end is a really important thing for us to be thinking about. I see whilst I've been wittering on, we've had a question in the chat from Mark. Does anyone have thoughts as to how to do this with anonymous surveys without EDI questions? I'm assuming from that the question is, how do we understand the experience of different people without asking for their protected characteristics? I'll sit back and ask if Hannah or Natasha or Fumi want to answer that. I've got some thoughts as well that I can share.
I'll share an example actually where it was anonymous with EDI questions. So a massive secondary school with 1,800 girls in it put out an EDI survey to all their pupils, but they didn't ask them anything else. So they didn't know what year group they were in, for example. And basically there was feedback in this massive survey that there was homophobia in the school, but they didn't know where the homophobia was. So whatever survey we're doing, it's having the balance, isn't it, of the markers that we know which identity groups is going to inform us, but we don't want to be, your point, Natasha, was really pertinent about, we don't want to like make one person stand out in the data, but we also need to ask enough questions to look at trends and patterns. They had to do all student 11 to 18 training on homophobia, where actually it was only one year group that had the issue in it. So I was almost going the opposite way with how I interpret that question. Natasha, and for me, what's your response of anonymous surveys and EDI questions? It was without. I've been too fast.
I think for me, it's just following the data, the activity that might be needed afterwards. And like you said, Hannah, if you don't have, it might make it harder to get that data. So more exploration would be needed. So it might be a survey, but then you need a focus group on top of that, or you need a follow-on survey. So I think it is just thinking that the survey does help you to decide on the next steps, and that's something worth thinking about as well.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think where the question is specifically about belonging, if we think about the data that I presented, it is, if without those kind of additional things that you can drill down into, it will tell you overall how we're doing. And to an extent, that's enough. If you do a survey and you find that actually nobody is having a negative experience in a particular way, then that we know there's no further action required. The likelihood is that you will see that there will be some people that aren't responding positively, and then it's a case of just understanding that these big averages and these kind of global pictures, and by global here I mean across the entire organization, these global pictures hide the story underneath it. And so having a sense that, yes, I've seen this overall number and now I've got a temperature check, and for example, I did this survey last year, and this year I've got 3% more positive answers than last year, then we're moving in the right direction and we can celebrate that. Or we're going in the wrong direction if the reverse is true. But knowing that the less you are able to drill down, you will likely be hiding some nuance.
Just to add to that, Iona, about support staff, because quite often it's an all-staff survey, but the support staff's experience is often very different to the teaching staff's experience. I did a big trust conference a few weeks ago, and I had 400 support staff in sessions. And they're like, this is the first time anyone's ever asked us about belonging. It's always about the teachers and it's always about the leaders, and they are often in the majority. So, and you often, in the schools I've worked at, you often have more diversity in the support staff profile than you do have in the teaching staff profile as well. So I want to spotlight them as a group to be looking at as well.
Fabulous. We have hit the 5 o'clock mark, and I don't have any other questions that are in the chat. So I think we can bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to Natasha, Funmi, and Hannah. The contributions are, I hope, really valuable to everybody. And as I said, we'll share the recordings of this and the previous session after the fact. And if anyone has any ongoing questions, do please give us a shout, and yeah, we'll be happy to move the conversation forward. Thanks, everyone.